I'm biased too because Orchid also works with me at Hashbang doing some side projects and some fun things. So yeah, we'll start out with the overall introductions that we got there and go into a little bit more detail about why we're here and why we were some of the first people that Orchid was thinking of when she was thinking, personal brands, really strong personal brands, who might that be? So I'll let everybody kind of do their own introductions about the development of their personal brand in a really short nutshell, because then we're going to go farther into detail about the process and the strategy behind developing a personal brand. But just kind of overall going down the line, say your name again and talk maybe about one particular aspect of your personal brand that you might think, like how you're probably perceived to the public as being known. Like one thing, like I'll go first and say it's usually the outfits. Most people are like, Lisa's always got some crazy outfit on. It looks like it's Comic-Con every single day of the year. So that's one of the aspects of my personal brand that I'm known for. I'll let you take it away.
I'm going to defer. Kate, can you go?
Okay. So I'm Kate Edwards, former executive director of the International Game Developers Association, and now I run my consulting company, Geogrify, which I've done for years. I guess the obvious aspect for those who know me is that I'm Thor, the goddess of thunder. That's what people know me for because of my cosplay as Thor, which I've been doing for years, but it's been conflated not only with my IGDA role, but just with who I am. So it's for curious reasons.
It's great.
Okay, I'm Brittany Hobbs. I am the GM and Director of Research and Branding for PH1 Media. I guess in terms of my personal brand, what I'm best known for, it has become my hair. I guess it's
Can hear you on that one.
Yeah. So for a very long time, it was the multitude of changing colors. But for the past probably 8 years, it's been the continuous shortening. And I guess for the past 4 or so, it's just been the very short hair. So so that's sort of become the thing that people recognize first about me.
That's awesome.
Hi, I'm Bebo, and I would say my personal brand, I'm very well known for my name. My name is Brittany Bow, and so 7th grade roll call, Bow, of course. And it's stuck. But people know me most well for my board game content, which usually involves putting cats in boxes. So,
Okay, Schrodinger.
yeah.
So yeah, I'm Lidi at Eastside. I've been there for about 4.5 years. We're based in Vancouver. And I'd say the strongest part of my brand is probably the parties that I throw, which is a shameless plug because we're throwing one tomorrow from 5 to 7. Yeah. So hit me up if you want an invite. But yeah, I think that's how I'm most well known in the industry.
Agreed.
And, wow, that's loud. I'm Mike Hines, and I think I'm best known as that Amazon guy who goes to all the game conferences.
That's a great way to put it. That's absolutely true. And sometimes that leads into my next question, actually. And sometimes the personal brand isn't necessarily something that you're actively cultivating, or that's something that you're thinking and you're like, okay, this is something that I want to put together. Sometimes it comes about very naturally, very organically, and sometimes it is very calculated and very cultivated for specific purposes. And I kind of wanted to put that out there as a question of, did yours evolve organically, or did you put a lot of thought and strategy into it, specifically maybe towards your audience? Because some of us have had lengthy careers, we won't say exactly how long, but it hasn't always been the same audience for me. I used to do corporate cosmetics marketing at Nordstrom, and as you can probably guess, that's a very different audience than video games. So my personal brand has pretty much stayed the same. Thankfully, it wasn't anything that Nordstrom couldn't handle, so more power to them. But that poses a challenge. So, was it organic? Did it happen just kind of by what you were doing in your day-to-day life and people started to notice that you were very consistent with it? Or was it something that it just was like, I feel like I have to do this in order to advance my career or be more well-known, or something that is lacking, and so I'm going to put this together? And whoever wants to take that first.
Yes and no. First of all, the going out and presenting at conferences started kind of with what really bugs me most is people who will go up there and just give a 20-minute pitch for whatever company it is that they're working for. So one of the things that I wanted to be about was actually delivering real value where you could go home after listening to one of my presentations and actually make money regardless on what platform or tool set you were using. How could you become more of what you wanted to be as a result of coming and listening to one of my presentations? And I worked hard to keep that consistent, if just not to be that guy, which is hardly a brand, not that guy. But it turned into we know that Mike is going to give really solid presentations. And the brand started with the conference organizers, actually. They got to know who I was because people kept saying, we really liked Mike's presentation. So Mike as a brand started with the people who invited me to speak. Then it became more intentional with a pair of slippers, which is a different story for later in the afternoon.
That's cool.
So yeah, I'd say for me, it definitely was an organic thing. So when I made the move from a very corporate job to work in gaming, it was really important to me to find a company that I really aligned with the values and aligned with the leadership. And so I found that in Eastside Games. That was the start of my brand, which was very different, as you had mentioned, in the corporate world, corporate academia, space that I used to work in, than working in tech and gaming. So, it happened organically in that I started that role, and then I very soon after started planning these parties, and then because of that networking opportunities, I was able to start speaking at conferences, and it's just grown from there.
And because I know you personally and have known you for a while, and your outfits and the way you put yourself together and all of that is very distinct, would you say that the audience of the video game industry allowed you to come into your own, whereas you wish you could have done that in your previous industry, but you just didn't quite feel like it would be as accepted, but in games you were like, finally, I'm able to dress the way I want and be myself and be true Lidi.
Absolutely. I didn't have any tattoos before I started this job, so that's part of it. And I almost never wear pants. I think tutus are also part of my aesthetic brand. So
Definitely.
Yeah, that's definitely a freedom that was allowed because of this industry, 100%.
Very cool.
Okay, so there we go. My brand kind of developed organically because I was the social media manager for GTS Distribution. I started there 4 years ago, and initially they were just like, here's a Facebook page, go for it. And I was just like, this isn't enough for me, I need to do more. So I ended up creating a YouTube channel called The Game Wire, and initially they bought it. It was originally a magazine from some other company that they purchased. And they were like, okay, well, here's a blog. Go ahead and start writing. And from there, I ended up writing these in-depth articles about board games and added GIFs, and eventually that evolved into my YouTube channel. And then I got this mischievous, adorable little ragdoll cat who has decided to insert himself into everything that I do when I do it all the time. So that was definitely something that evolved on its own only about a year ago, but I think my cat is more beloved by the internet than I might even be. So
That's so cool.
He's a precious little baby.
That's very meta as far as a personal brand goes, because so many of us sometimes will fall into a role, and I think you've probably had this too, is like you become the mascot of whatever game company you're representing. But instead you actually have a mascot for your personal brand.
Yeah,
That's super cool.
Okay, so for me, I think sort of part work at it, sort of part fall into it. So I actually started out working in the advertising industry and have kind of always been creative peripheral. So within that sort of a setting, no matter what you look like, you kind of always fit in / still fall by the wayside, just personal appearance-wise. So I think in that sense, it's really interesting because it gives you the flexibility to play around a little bit with who you can be and how you can stand out in that. I do think that by choosing to, sorry, I'm starting to lose my voice a little. By choosing to change up your appearance or to change up little things about you that give you added confidence or that make you stand out in people's minds a little bit more than you might have when you look just like anybody else. So I sort of suffered as a teenager and into my 20s by the symptom of constantly meeting people being like, I think I know your sister. you look exactly like someone I was friends with in high school. So by changing that up a little bit, it also gives you that added confidence that allows you to try new things that maybe you wouldn't have in your life otherwise. And I think part of that comes to, then you start to realize that you're like, you know what, I actually like being in front of people. I like being able to talk to people and share knowledge, and I like being able to grow outside of just the role that you're in. So I think it kind of goes both ways.
Very cool. Excellent answer.
Well, I think in my case, since I've been around a while, I kind of had two identities. One, when my days at Microsoft as a geographer there, running the geopolitical team I started, I was known as Dr. Ware internally, because there was an alias, Dr. Ware at Microsoft.com, where you could ask any geography or politics question you can imagine, and I would answer it, because that was part of what I did within the company. And so I had this reputation as being this geographer at large in the game industry, and in the IT sector. When I went and consulted for Google and created their geopolitical team, my alias at Google was mapgeek at google.com. So it's kind of carried over. But and the other thing, so that was kind of one identity that I carried with me. It's like, oh yeah, she's that kind of weird culturalization, geopolitics person in the game industry. And so I'm like, okay, I'm fine with that. That was an identity though, and a lot of people sought me out because of that particular skill set. When I took the IGDA role, I mean, I think that changed quite a bit. That took on a different identity because I was very vocal. I kind of, at that point in my career and in my personality, I basically took on a fearless nature where I will speak out, and I will speak out loudly, and I don't care who, backlashes at me. And what really, I think, where it really came through was during Gamergate, because as one of their primary targets for a year and a half, a lot of people started conflating my Thor cosplay with my role as executive director of the IGDA. And at first I was actively resisting that. I'm like, no, don't bring Thor into that. That's just something I do for fun with my daughter. We cosplay together. It's just, it's a hobby of mine. But a lot of people kept doing it because I think for them, in the context of what was going on socially, they liked the idea that this woman running the IGDA also wielded a hammer and was strong and all that kind of stuff. And it did resonate with me. So up to that point, I was not cultivating it at all. But once I kind of realized, especially in the early months of Gamergate, where I was like, people seem to respond to that. This gives them some good feeling. And so I'm going to just roll with it. I'm not going to resist it anymore. I didn't try and really play it up that much either, but I didn't resist it anymore. And so I just kind of rolled with it. And I told people too, because a lot of people would ask me, well, why do you cosplay anyway? And I told them, I said, well, a lot of it is because, especially my Thor costume, I said the very first time I put it on years ago, I was standing there in a car garage with my daughters. We were getting ready to go to San Diego Comic-Con, and I was just like feeling all this armor and stuff and the hammer in my hand. And I said, I feel so freaking kick-ass right now. And what I realized, though, the more I cosplayed that particular character, is I said, this is the external representation of how I feel about myself. And that's why I like it, because in this brief glimpse at events like that, you get to see, like, that's me. Yeah. And so I think that kind of came out during the whole leadership of the IGDA, and so I kind of rolled with it. And so, I mean, every single day I will get people making some reference to where's your hammer? Or, I posted something on Facebook this morning and someone said, oh, I thought you were out fighting frost giants. And it just keeps coming up, and I just roll with it. It's like, whatever. It's cool.
So how are you going to keep rolling with that, Kate? I mean, it was tied to IGDA, but what you do next, are you going to intentionally make Thor a part of that?
I probably will. I don't think I can escape it anyway, and I'm cool with that. It's okay.
I think that's fantastic, and that's an excellent point. Is sometimes a personal brand does have to evolve and change over time, perhaps throughout different industries that you're involved in. But I think we all noticed that there was a consistent theme here as far as authenticity, and I know that's kind of a buzzword around conferences and whatnot, but when you're talking about the context of personal brand, authenticity is basically the most important thing. And so if everybody's sitting here saying that, well, this pretty much evolved organically, and it evolved because I was doing something that I held dear to me, or that I was passionate about in my personal life, and it started to seep out and evolve into my professional life. And a lot of people in certain industries will make sure and take very active stances to make sure that their personal life and their professional life never intermix. But everybody up here that's noted as being a very strong in their personal brand situation, we've all experienced the authenticity that's just like, I can't stop it now. So the Thor thing is just like, it's become a tsunami of awesomeness, and there's no stopping it for you. So I totally understand where that's coming from. Were you gonna say something?
No.
Oh, okay, just checking. So this is kind of an interesting thing too, because when we were talking about cultivating a personal brand, sometimes that can be perceived as being a negative thing, like you're actively out there trying to put together some sort of shtick. And we've just established now in the past conversation that everything was very organic and it evolved authentically. But does anybody up here actually have a formal marketing background? Isn't that cool? I mean, only one person. And to be honest, even though I do marketing for a career, my degree was in German, so I guess people could argue that I don't have a formal marketing background. So
Technically, it's in psychology, but then I worked in advertising for 10 years.
Nice. I'm gonna kind of put you on the spot now
Yeah, I'll keep
and
holding
ask
this.
you, you know, how has that helped or hindered? Do people look at you, because they look at me as the CMO, I'm the marketing girl, or, you know, you lead the marketing department, so of course you have to have a strong personal brand because you're a marketer. How could you market something else if you can't market yourself? But how would you say that that's maybe helped or hindered?
Well, I will personally admit that I probably have the weakest personal brand of everyone up here, just because when you spend a really long time helping others and other companies with their personal brands, you understand exactly how exhausting it is, and so it can actually be quite difficult. So I'm much more actively now trying to cultivate that brand for myself and for my company, just because I know how important it is, but you know, you do need to take that time and really decide what parts of it are most important and how you're going to play that out over time as well, because it is a very lengthy process as well.
Yeah, agreed. And that also ties into something that we touched on a little bit ago as far as becoming a mascot of the particular company that you might be representing. And so there's a very fine line where the personal brand of you and yourself and your career gets intertwined with the company that you're representing. And do you go through active efforts to make sure that your personal brand is just you, or do you give absolutely everything 100% to whichever company you're working for at the time? Or, you know, how do you manage the two as being distinct? And I'm sure you've got, or probably even good stories about this too.
Well, I mean, for me, that was directly relevant because when I was at Microsoft running the geopolitical team that I had started, I mean, within the company, I had a very clear reputation. I mean, I had consulted with Bill and Steve, and I mean, pretty much everyone up and down knew my function, whether they liked it or not. But so I was, you know, I had basically a very clear reputation in the company. The moment I left Microsoft in 2005, then what was telling is that 2 months later I went to E3. So this was the first E3 after I leaving Microsoft. I was nobody. I could not get access to booths because, oh, you're not Microsoft anymore. But you let me in last year and you didn't even know me. It's like, oh, sorry, you know. And so it's just like that lack of association was. I guess I just wasn't very conscious of it because, again, I have no marketing background. I had never tried to really personally market myself. So that was an eye-opener for me. I'm like, holy crap, these people, it's not like they dislike me. It's just like, I understand. They prioritize people based on who they're associated with. And so at that moment, I'm like, I'm not associated with anybody anymore. So after 13 years at Microsoft, I'm like, wow, I'm just like, it felt like I was just cast away, like you're nothing now. And so I did have to actively think about, how do I brand myself? How do I market myself? And it was tough because I have no marketing background, and a lot of it was based on me having to listen to myself, explain to people what I do for a living, you know, what I do in my consulting work, and that kind of eventually got to a point where talking to a lot of people and trying to find what's the right catchphrase, which in my case was maximize your global reach, because that really kind of said, oh, wow, that sounds interesting. But it took time to do it. It was difficult to do, but eventually I felt I kind of did it, but it was not easy.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think to that point, it is definitely really challenging, and I think that especially when you early on in your career or in your personal brand, it's always going to be more difficult because whatever company you work for is going to be how you see your personality, how you see yourself, and how you see your role within the world or within this industry. And so I think that it is infinitely harder to have a personal brand outside of that unless you're very actively trying to do it. But there is a lot of danger to that as well. So the more you're able to establish yourself separately, the more you're able to be transferable. And so, even when you look at who your personal brand is or what you are, like you said, for example, like who has a background in marketing, I actually find that it's very detrimental for me to talk about myself in the reference of marketing, because people understand marketing as this kind of lump bucket of things, and once you're seen as a marketer, it's very challenging to get outside of that. I will constantly explain to people what it is that we do with our company, and they'll be like, oh, but you do marketing. Can you do my marketing? Can you do AdWords? Can you do, and it's like they start listing off all the things that they see as marketing. And I actually don't do most of those things within my role now. And so it is definitely challenging. But the other side, like the flip side of it is, if you are building your own business, then who you are as a brand is intrinsically linked to that as well. So now that I am the head of a business that that is my own business, I have to be the representation of that. And so that has forced me to really put myself out there in a way that you wouldn't normally. And so you really have to start to cultivate not just who your personal brand is, but who your brand is as your role within that organization that you're also building. So it's very tricky, and it's a little bit of you kind of have to build 3 brands. So you're building your company's brand, you're building your own personal brand, and then you're building the brand of who you are within that organization.
Beautifully said. Anybody else have any other?
Yeah, I'd say for me that, my personal brand and the Eastside Games brand are very linked, and I think that's a result of this being my first job in gaming, even though I've been there for a long time. This is where I've really formed this version of myself, and I don't really see that changing, if I were to go somewhere else. This is what you get. This is me. But I haven't really, thought about that too much. It's interesting.
It's one of the risks. There are many, but it's an interesting one to have to mitigate.
I'm definitely in the same situation in that this was my first my first job in tabletop gaming, and because I was the only person initially to build the brand, I've still not found a way to disconnect me from my company in any way, shape, or form. Despite my best efforts, I've been like, hey, why don't we have some guest writers on GameWire? Let's have some more people. And they're like, yeah, totally, we'll do that. But then everybody's still like, oh, GameWire, Bebo. And I'm just like, yes, I know. But it's not necessarily a bad thing, because I'm really proud of all the work that I get to do. And honestly, I can't go to a board game convention without people being like, hey, come look at our game. So
That's super cool.
it's great.
Did you have anything?
So Amazon is this huge 800-pound gorilla, and I'm this tiny little hair somewhere lost on the gorilla. But it's very fortunate because it's a symbiotic relationship. When I first started with the Amazon App Store at Amazon, we had to pay a ton of money to get speaking slots at the tiniest little game conferences, because no one knew who Amazon was. Nobody wanted to hear an Amazon pitch for games. Really? Game store at Amazon? Seriously? No, you got to pay a lot. But after I was able to actually deliver some, what I'm hoping was real value, we started getting more and more invitations, to the point where I now turn down more speaking opportunities that I'm offered, and we haven't had to buy a speaking opportunity for years now. And so in that sense, Amazon, the 800-pound gorilla, has really benefited from kind of the personal brand that I've helped build around the kind of presentations and talks that I'll do. And similarly, nobody would invite me anywhere to talk about anything without Amazon written over the top of my badge. It's my access to 750,000 games that I get to research and then share the learnings about that gets me in the door, so I can help build Amazon's credibility in the space. So it's very symbiotic.
That's excellent. And that's actually the next segue into into my next question / bullet point of this, in that this is a really personal part of this topic for me. I did a talk called The Economy of Weird for TEDx Seattle a while back. And the reason I called it The Economy of Weird is because one of the things that I get asked a lot is, well, what does all of this do for the bottom line? Like, how could anything measurable actually come of you wearing crazy outfits all the time? And you just touched on that there are substantial benefits from having a really strong personal brand that happen. And like Kate, you hit on it too, as far as like maybe getting up and jumping the line and getting more invitations to things. Are there some specific stories, other than what we just mentioned, where you found that maybe there is some growth hacking, buzzword, involved in having a really strong personal brand?
I have one, definitely.
Yeah, go for it.
So when I very first started here, my boss told me, he said, okay, we're going to go to Board Game Geek Con. It's your first convention ever. You've really got to make an impression. He did not expect me to show up with bright pink hair. And so I did that, and honestly, I just switched my hair back to a normal, natural hair color 2 weeks ago. And so for a very long time, I was known for my brightly colored hair, which I recently ditched for the sake of like attempting to be more professional.
We'll get to that too.
Yeah, I know. Well, that's just it. Is that, and it was interesting because the big change that I noticed was how people treat me in my day-to-day life, and that was very jarring for me because suddenly I have a 7-year-old daughter, and keep in mind when I had pink crazy hair, the other adults at her school thought that I had her when I was like 11, and they were completely appalled by my sheer existence. And so I did see a lot of growth from the crazy colored hair, but once I realized that I had established that growth and it wasn't going anywhere, I was like, okay, I'm ready to like live the mom life and toned it down a little bit for the sake of my child. But it absolutely helped with my growth, establishing like my crazy hair and my really crazy colored clothes and dresses and stuff that I was wearing, which was fantastic, until I looked around and realized that there were 0 people with natural colored hair in any of my board game conventions. So I was like, well, now I'll be the weird one with normal hair, and made the change.
It's all relative. It's all very relative. 10 years ago, colored hair was just not a thing, and now it's practically ubiquitous in our industry. And
Yeah.
especially if you say you're in any side of the creative house and you don't have weird hair or a weird look, and people are like, really? Are you sure you're on the creative team? And I'm not, are you sure you're not in finance? Like people can't quite put that together. So beautifully said. Anybody else?
I'll mention really quick. I just realized recently, I left the IGDA about a month ago, and one of the things I was hoping to establish, besides forward the mission of the organization, is actually help people understand what I personally stand for, that I will be an active advocate, and I will speak out regardless if I'm in the IGDA or not. And what was telling to me is that when I left the IGDA, and there was several events that I'm lined up for to be a speaker at, and they're all like, well, we still want you to come. We still want you to speak. So the association of me with the IGDA, while yes, that was important to them, but what they also feel is important is the fact that they want my voice and I still have the same drive, I still have the same desire, the same level of advocacy that I had before. It just, my association has changed, but from their perspective, that's okay. And so that was a good sign for me. It felt really good to know that they're like, we still want you to come, which is great, because this is 12 years after I left Microsoft, where I got the exact opposite reaction. You're not with Microsoft, back of the line. So
Right.
it's nice.
Yeah, I think something that you said before about authenticity, I think is really important as well when it comes to something like a personal brand. So the moment that you transition from it being sort of a physical thing that people recognize you, to all of a sudden having people understand what you stand for and what your values are, and finding that community of people that you connect with in an authentic way as well, and they can understand you, you then can transition away from it being a shtick or from it being something that strangers can recognize, to it being people who are like-minded, who are potentially better fits for you in your career to understand you. That's when you're going to have that longevity and that long-lasting collaboration and opportunities and community in general.
Agreed. Yeah, I think that's a really wonderful. I really like your story about how much money you've saved Amazon from doing what you're doing, and having those kinds of actual concrete stories of this personal brand has helped my company achieve X, and especially if it has something to do with, actual dollar amounts and things like that, you could really put it on paper and justify all of this that we've put together out there. And as we're talking about all of these things, we've talked about a lot of these great positive things that have come of that. There's also, of course, the flip side, and there are some of the negative things and some of the caveats and some of the risks involved in putting yourself out there to the world in such a way that gets you noticed. So if you decide to do this, if you decide to put yourself out there in a way, and it's not necessarily the physical, because it can also be the perception, it can be any kind of aspect of the personal brand, but I suppose the easiest target is just the physical perception of how you put yourself out there to the world. What are some of the things that you've encountered as being some of the negative things, and what did you do about that to perhaps turn it around and make it a positive?
So my example isn't so much a negative, but it's just something to be conscious of is, as a mascot or as someone representing not only yourself but your studio, and if people know who you are everywhere, you just have to be on the hook for that reputation all the time. So you lose that anonymity of being able to go out and sort of do your own thing because you're always representing yourself in that studio. And so I don't think, just as long as you're not an asshole, it's probably not an issue. But I just, you lose the ability to have that, that freedom to do what you want because you're always in line, which can also be a positive though. You have that responsibility and you have the ability to, initiate change in people's perceptions and change in behavior. And I think that that's a really important and powerful position. So,
Agreed.
a negative and a positive.
That's a good point.
I personally feel like I'm constantly under a microscope with every single thing that I ever put on social media, ever, regardless of whether or not it's private. Primarily because I am. And I realized the other day that when I first started my Facebook account, forever ago, right? I had 150 friends or something like that. And now I have over 1,000 or something ridiculous like that. And that means that 90% of my Facebook friends are professional industry contacts, which means I'm just not allowed to have a personal life outside of cats and gaming, which is okay. I love cats and gaming. But at the end of the day, I can't really ever say anything negative in any way, shape, or form because it could be perceived the wrong way, as I discovered earlier this week, which was a very challenging situation. But I'm working my best to overcome that. And I think that at the end of the day, really realizing that I can't separate the two, my personal page from my professional, has been jarring, but also a fantastic learning experience for me.
That's okay. I thank you. One thing that I would say, though, is that there's a really common misconception about wanting to keep everything completely professional. And I think that especially when it comes to a personal brand, having a little bit more of that personality and allowing yourself to just relax into it a little bit is actually an okay thing as well. Because even when you have those really jarring experiences where you get a negative reaction or you have people reacting a different way than you were expecting, I think that there's also something really nice and really good about understanding your personal brand to the point of culling a little. Sometimes those people aren't people who are actually able to help build you out. And I think that losing some of those people because they're not okay with who you actually are versus who they think you are is okay. And one of the things that, I've been quite lucky. I haven't really had many experiences where I've had really negative impacts, but also my personal brand is not very flashy or flamboyant. But at the same time, one of the things that I am constantly trying to advocate for is doing better research and just being very honest and authentic, and sometimes just saying to people who are following you or engaging with you and literally just asking them about, sometimes it's okay to just ask straight up, what are the things that are working and what aren't, and really start to get feedback that way. But the other way, the easier way, I guess, is to literally just try new things and try and be more of who you actually want to be, and then see how they work and they don't. We're constantly learning within let's say development and design, we constantly have this idea of like, okay, it's okay to test things out and to constantly be learning and finding out what parts of this game people really like and which parts don't they like, what features do we need to call really quickly, but we forget that you can do that with your personal brand as well. It's just as easy to do that and to test out and say, you know what, I really want to try and do this thing, or this thing's really important to me, so I'm going to talk about it, and then see what people react to and what they don't. And if it's generally positive with some negatives, that's okay. You're going to learn just as much from that.
Well said. Agreed.
I have 3 sets of stakeholders, my company, my audience, and my family, and they don't all have the same goals or expectations of me. As a matter of fact, sometimes they're in direct conflict with each other. Amazon says, Mike, you've got an extra 4 days between these 2 trips. You can go to South America. My family's like, the hell you can. So it's really hard sometimes to balance that. And then there's, kind of the audience expectations versus kind of the stuff that I want to share and talk about. I'm very politically passionate, but I don't dare share that on my personal brand site because some of the things I'm passionate about can be controversial to some audiences. And I don't want to hurt my audience. I care about my audience. I don't want to make them uncomfortable. I don't want to make them nervous around me. I don't want to, I want my audience to be happy and comfortable. So I don't want to share those parts that I'm passionate about that might put them in that uncomfortable spot. So it's this balancing act that was really driven home. I was by myself early in the morning at the airport in St. Petersburg, Russia, and I was talking with my daughter on the phone because she wanted to get some cosmetics from the duty-free store. And while I'm sitting there talking to my daughter on the phone, a couple guys come up. Wait, you're Mike Hines from Amazon. Oh, can we have a selfie? Could we have a selfie? And so here I am talking to my daughter on the phone, and these people are asking me for a selfie in the St. Petersburg airport. Okay, I'm glad I was talking to my daughter on the phone and not reading something like, Nut Job Weekly or, whatever magazine, you could possibly conceivably be reading, right? So when you're at the airport, you think your time's your own, but your time's not your own at the airport necessarily. And while my daughter thought it was adorable that our conversation was interrupted because someone wanted a selfie with Dad, I don't suspect my wife would have been quite as tolerant or understanding. So it's an interesting balancing act.
I mean, I would echo a lot of what was said in terms of the lack of privacy. I mean, that's more about being a public figure, which I guess you could assume if you have a personal brand, you likely have some kind of level of public notoriety. Running the IGA, I could not post anything remotely political, remotely anything on Facebook, LinkedIn, you name it. I mean, I have a whole ocean of opinion churning inside me that I can only express with family and close friends who get me and understand me. But for 5 years, basically I just keep my mouth shut, just smile, just subtly drop a hint now and then about something, how I feel about something in particular, unless it happened to dovetail exactly with my role as an advocate for the game industry, in which case I will speak out very loudly. Like when the immigration ban was enacted or was discussed earlier this year, and we as the IGA supported the Resist Jam, that was something where it's just like, hey, this is something I feel very personally passionate about, and I get to express it publicly. But the only other thing I wanted to mention is just the idea of not being taken seriously because of your personal brand. That's exactly why I was fighting this whole conflation with my Thor cosplay initially during Gamergate, because I mean, this is an extremely serious issue. We've got women in the industry being openly harassed, the industry's not being supportive in all kinds of bad ways. And it's like, I was taking this extremely seriously, and yet people are like, but Thor's doing blah, blah. I'm like, haha, yeah, it's funny, but it's not funny. But then eventually, like I said, it's just because I actually talking to people who kept saying, and I'd say, why are you saying this? Because it gives me hope. It makes me feel better about the situation. And that's when I kind of, okay, I'll just go with it. But that was my biggest fear, is not being taken seriously.
Mm-hmm. Kate, one of the things that I really value about you is our friendship. And when I am burning up inside with stuff that I can't talk about publicly, you're going to be at every conference that I'm going to be at, right? And you're always there. And I can kind of take you aside and just let off some steam and talk about whatever's on my mind. And you're always there, you're always supportive, and nothing that we have ever talked about has ever gone past that little cone of silence. And it's so important knowing that I have someone with whom I can feel safe and comfortable, that I can be non-branded Mike for just a few minutes. So thank you for that.
Absolutely, and it's reciprocal.
We're all comrades up here fighting the same fight. So it looks like Orchid just gave me the 5-minute sign, and I believe we have 5 minutes until Q&A. So I'm going to go with that as our situation. And in closing, would say that a lot of these things that we touched on, what would be some advice that you would give to someone who's in the process of cultivating their personal brand and putting things together? We've talked about some of the really amazing things and benefits that can happen from doing so, and the hard work that it goes into to put this together. It does pay off. We've talked about some of the risks and some of the caveats of doing so, and some of the pitfalls that you might fall into along the way. I would say probably the advice that I give the most often when I'm asked about this is because of the issue of sometimes not being taken seriously just because of someone else's perception of you. One of the things that I've learned over the past 20 years of doing this is that you have to work extra hard, double, triple, really, really hard to back all of this up with substance so that people take you seriously, and you have to do it consistently. So with that, I'll kind of lead into anybody's advice for how to continue this as an ongoing thing, but also if you're just starting out, like what are some of the things? I think you, as you mentioned too, that doing some A/B testing is a really good bit of advice too. So anybody else want to elaborate on some of those things?
I think we've touched on it several times, so I won't be long, but having it be something that is very sincere and comes from your heart, I can't think of anything more exhausting than if my personal brand was a persona that I had to put on every morning and it wasn't exactly who I am. But, I'm in a role in a company where I'm very fortunate to have those things work really well together. But that's my advice.
I am also in a situation where I'm very passionate about what I'm doing, but the best lesson that I learned, that I taught myself over time, was to cultivate an environment that reflects your brand back at you. I work from my house, and so I've basically decorated my environment to be like so bright and colorful and happy, and because social media is such a big part of my life and such a big part of what I do professionally, I painted every single wall in my house and bought all new furniture and just made everything so inspiring around me that I couldn't help but produce content because my environment as a whole inspires me to create it.
That's awesome.
I will share some advice that personally has stuck with me as I've worked through how to build out what my brand is now that I'm not working for a recognized company. I would say it is when you're starting out building out your brand, likely nobody notices what you do. So take advantage of that and really just try and put out as much content as quickly as you can so that you can start to get some traction, but also get better at it. I think the first real article that I wrote took probably about 15 hours longer than it needed to, so it probably took about 20 hours to write, and I think 50 people read it. So, take advantage of the fact that you can make a lot of mistakes and you can look back at it later and laugh, but more importantly to that is if it's in your head, if it's not something that's tangible that you can hand to someone else and they can understand it, it does not exist in the world. So just start.
And one thing that I would mention too is that even though the brand is personal and it is something that comes from you and from your own passion and your heart, I do think there is some value in listening to those around you to understand what brand they perceive in you. Just, I guess, for lack of a better thing, or because I'm a geek, to use a superhero analogy, you walk around thinking that you're Black Widow from the Avengers, but everyone sees you as Wonder Woman. And so it kind of helps to know that, because if you're trying to keep pushing yourself off as Black Widow, then there's some disjointed nature there. So you kind of at some point you might want to think about what people are actually perceiving in you, but obviously you don't want to completely lose what you feel is truly your brand.
Yeah, to that point, when you actually do get into marketing world, the reality of what a brand is one, it is literally every touch point that people consume or see of you. But branding really looks at what do people perceive you as, what do you perceive yourself as, and your brand is typically something in the middle. So it's never both
Very true.
or either.
So it's good to have focus groups every now and then.